These are the risk factors that we see. Now, we have had the right conditions for Kikuyu poisoning again. It only seems to happen when we've had a drought and then we get drought-breaking rain in late summer or autumn. Now, we've had that, but I don't think many of you have had enough rain that we've got the conditions that might suit Kikuyu poisoning. We haven't got that leaping out of the ground, all's well, you know, we've got an enormous crop of Kikuyu coming through. However, some of the people around Gloucester, where we do periodically see it, probably have had enough rain for it. And if that's the case, in the next week or so, we'll probably see some cases. So it needs to have been significantly stressed. We don't see it on irrigated pasture. Because it hasn't been badly stressed enough. And this is important. It occurs when there's no alternative feed. So either it's fence line to fence line Kikuyu, or if there's a bit of other feed in there, they're finished with that and they're forced to eat the Kikuyu. And that's when we see problems. It appears to have a bad taste associated with it, so if you give them something else to eat, they'll go after it and you'll be saved. That's a typical paddock where Kikuyu poisoning has occurred, and that's the solution. That's the best. Where there is nothing else in that paddock apart from Kikuyu, you have to provide them with something else. We did a survey and we were very limited. There were more people affected than 9 herds, but we wanted to be absolutely sure it was Kikuyu poisoning. And people have a habit. They'll hear there's a Kikuyu poisoning outbreak, so they have some animals drop dead. I'm suffering from it too. We were very strict with the case definitions here. It had to be where there was nothing but Kikuyu to eat. So cattle on mixed pasture, I doubt very much you're going to lose cattle to Kikuyu poisoning. 1 to 3 days of access. Where are we? 1 to 2 weeks after drought-breaking rain. So we might not be there yet, but watch out for it. Those that are affected, most of them die. If they recover though, they tend to recover completely. So if you get affected in the end and you do lose some animals and you're satisfied you know what it is, get in touch with us because we're interested in knowing whether there's any prolonged effect in these animals. It gets a bit complicated to explain, but it's to do with the damage in the gut. It's exactly the same under a microscope as if they had grain poisoning. Now, if you have animals that survive grain poisoning, a lot of those will have secondary problems later on, and I can't understand why we don't see secondary problems in the cows that survive Kikuyu poisoning. It doesn't make good sense. So there's quite a lot about Kikuyu poisoning we don't yet know. That's what it does. It's fluid dynamics. It destroys them. So the poor cows will be well hydrated and they're eating very watery, lush Kikuyu. There's plenty of fluid going into them, and yet they'll become extraordinarily dehydrated. So when you pinch their skin up, it stays up, sunken eyes. A lot of the fluid from their bloodstream ends up rushing into their rumen. And you can hear some of them slosh as they walk. Now, because they're terribly dehydrated, they know they want a drink to reverse that. And they'll stand at a trough or in a dam and attempt to drink, but their gut is completely full. So it's a bit of a cruel death. It must be terribly uncomfortable. They can't fit any more fluid in. So drooling, sham drinking, that sort of thing, staggering, down they go, and the majority of them die. There you go. So that's the clinical signs. Carol mentioned the potassium levels. We'll come to that in a moment. So that's a typical animal, and you can see there's nothing else in there for that girl to get to. Obviously the rumen's pretty full, and you get a great flood of fluid and plant material when you open them up. That's typical of Kikuyu poisoning. What you can't see is that there is genuine damage to the lining of all of the stomachs, and we're still trying to understand that. It's like an acidosis damage. Now, you can't read that. I'm aware of that. What it was meant to show you with a typical case, the damage that's recorded here in the stomachs. Here's another one. It's exactly the same. Ruminitis, necrosuppurative, acute multifocal with intracorneal pustules. I know that doesn't mean much to you. There's another one. Take my word for it. It says exactly the same thing. And again. And they're significant. We'll come to the next couple of slides. These are the theories about what's causing it. There's still a strong a bit of support for the idea it's a fungus that grows on the Kikuyu during that rapidly growing phase. Whether or not that's true, there are other people who now suggest it's to do with the fact that the young plant is terribly high in potassium, and there is certainly an imbalance, an electrolyte imbalance associated with all this fluid rushing back into the rumen. The trouble with it is, if you do a literature search worldwide, we can't find any evidence that high potassium by itself causes physical damage to the lining of the stomach. So I don't know. So there are theories. That's some of them there. We don't know. Boral, this was just to show you that we have high potassium. That's the high K that Carol was talking about. That's in eyeball fluid out of a dead animal. Now, this is the cat amongst the pigeons, though. This was an animal I got excited about last year or the year before because it was a classic case of Kikuyu poisoning, sham drinking, sloshing when she walked, all that sort of stuff, all the post-mortem changes, but she was on hay. It was meant to be Kikuyu hay. That would be the first time we'd had a death on hay. It has to be on fresh pasture. However, when I got the sample of the hay, it was mixed hay. So there's a problem. So you can get similar damage and similar signs, and it's not even attributable necessarily to Kikuyu. And this is one of Digby's. It happened last year during the outbreak last year, which was more limited. Exactly the same signs in the stomach, and it's on sorghum. So there's more work that needs to be done on this, and you'd say someone should do a PhD on it, but because we typically only get outbreaks every 10 years, it might take you a while to complete your PhD. That was just to show you just how high the potassium levels in the plants are. I know you can't read that either. Reducing the risk. Well, the main thing is be aware that Kikuyu is a fantastic pasture species, this is rare. This doesn't happen often. You have to have these conditions, and we don't understand what sets it off. Just be aware that possibly in this kind of environment, if you've got a lot of rain now and you've got a lot of Kikuyu, there could be a risk. Now, the reason we mention it here is because I'd say to you normally, you need to get yourself a few good round bales of safe hay and have them in the shed just in case you get this sort of situation. You might struggle at the moment to get yourself some good round bales to put out when you need them in a hurry if you suddenly have a foot of Kikuyu coming up out of the ground. So just be aware if you've got those sort of paddocks, alternative feed is the secret. I worry about this salt thing that we created an urban myth. People now are telling you that salt will be protective. Put out some sodium chloride blocks. We were just curious. We asked people to put salt blocks out because there is an imbalance between potassium and sodium. Sodium is that Na there. And so we were interested in seeing whether the cattle that don't normally crave salt, sodium chloride, would go for it if you put the lick blocks out. Now that unfortunately has been misunderstood, and I hear coming back to me, you only need to put a couple of salt blocks out and that'll protect them. I doubt that very much. But giving them access to alternative feed will reliably save them. So that's the advice. This one is from an agronomist, Josh Hack, and what Carol was talking about. It's bad policy anyway to flog your Kikuyu at that very young stage of growth. So pasture management should dictate that you let it get to the 4 or 5 leaf stage, which I'm reliably told is when it's a 1.5 foot high or whatever, or at least a foot high. And see, that period of risk with the young growing plant, it only lasts 3 or 4 weeks, and then you're right. I've seen people slash this stuff and, oh, well, we're not going to use it. The risk seems to pass. So I'd be a little bit wary. If we're not going to get a lot more regrowth before winter, I just don't know if I'd waste it. I think you need to be careful with it, and you watch the cattle you put back in, but I don't think I'd waste it. If it were mine, I'd leave it there.